Well, this morning we're talking about rest and refreshment and silence and solitude. So if you, by chance, fall asleep today, it's really okay. Just this one time, though. I know some of you are regulars, but we find our story this morning. Elijah is on the run. And he's running because of something that happened, something famous that happened in the scene right before our text this morning. You'll remember Elijah is a Hebrew prophet for the Lord, and he serves in the northern kingdom of Israel. Ahab, who you heard mentioned, is the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And Ahab, in order to gain influence and to grow his kingdom, he marries a foreign princess named Jezebel. And Jezebel, when she comes to Israel, she brings her god with her, Baal. Now, Jezebel sets up temples for Baal. She brings in prophets for Baal, hundreds of prophets, and she even gets the king Ahab to worship Baal, along with many other Israelites. And Elijah sees what's happening in his country, and so he decides that he's going to challenge the prophets of Baal to a divine contest, a holy contest, to prove who is the one true God. Now, Ahab sends word to all of Israel, and they gather together. The Israelites gather together. The 450 prophets of Baal gather together on a mountain for the big showdown. And Elijah says, let's cut up 2 bulls. We're going to put one bull on this altar, and we'll put another bull on this altar. And then you, 450 prophets of Baal, you prophesy, you pray, you cry out. And then I will pray to the Lord. And whoever burns up their bull, we will know that that God is the one true God. So the prophets of Baal, they go first, and they start praying, they start prophesying, they start crying out and calling to Baal, and nothing happens. And so they start cutting themselves to try and get Baal's attention. And Elijah, he starts making fun of them. He's like, guys, you need to shout louder. Maybe Baal's sleeping. Maybe he's on a vacation. Still, nothing happens. And then it's Elijah's turn. But before he gets started, he soaks his bowl in water, dumps water and more water on top of his bowl. And then he prays to the Lord his God. And then there comes from heaven such a fire that not just the bowl gets burnt up, but the wood on the altar, the rocks, the dust, and the water, all of it gone. And then Elijah does something in the wake of his victory that is somewhat alarming. He has all the 450 prophets of Baal executed. And as you might imagine, Jezebel does not like this. She doesn't like it one bit. So she sends a message to Elijah saying, hey, Elijah, by this time tomorrow, I'm going to make you dead. So he gets afraid. And so we find Elijah in our text running for his life, scared. But soon his fear turns into dread and despair. And after fleeing into the wilderness of Judah, he sits down under a broom tree, and he is in a totally depressed state. He wants to die. He even says to God, that's enough, Lord. That's it. I'm done. Take away my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And then he falls asleep. Perhaps intending never to wake up again. Remember, he's in the wilderness. He's in the desert. Consider the range of emotions that Elijah felt in this story. Fear, anger, depression, exhaustion, Can you think of a time in your life where you felt those feelings? Maybe a time in your life where you were absolutely overcome with fear. Or maybe a time in your life where you failed so badly that you wanted to go hide under a broom tree or a rock. Or perhaps a time where you were so utterly depressed, maybe like Elijah, you wanted to give up too. We know these feelings. And we find Elijah afraid, defeated, depressed, exhausted. And how does God meet Elijah in the midst of all of those feelings? You'll notice that God doesn't lecture him. God doesn't shame him. God doesn't condemn him. God doesn't say, Elijah, you should have done more. You should be more. What are you doing? No. What does God do? He fixes him breakfast in bed. That's awesome. And then he lets him take a nap. Friends, this is all I want for Father's Day. Breakfast in bed and a nap. God gets it. Thank you, Tom. The reality is we do not have to overcomplicate things. We don't always have to over-spiritualize things. God knows that sometimes we just need rest. We have physical bodies with physical limitations. Elijah says, I want to die. And God says, you know, Elijah, you look really tired. Your blood sugar is probably low. How about you put your feet up, take a little snooze, I'll make you a cake, and then we'll talk after. It's amazing what a nap and a cake will do for somebody. I did check the Hebrew word there. It is cake. So we need rest, friends, and God knows it. Are you tired? I feel like there's a lot of people tired today. I think God has a word for you this morning if you're feeling exhausted. Remember, even God rested on the seventh day after he created the cosmos. Even God took a break. Are you getting enough rest? Are you sleeping enough? Or do you think that you are bigger than God and that you have to keep going? Our bodies are specifically designed to only function properly if we are receiving rest and nourishment. Research shows how bad sleep contributes to cancer, heart disease, degenerative brain disease. Conversely, consistent sleep patterns promote longer life, better physical and mental health. This is why having shift work in the night is now considered a health hazard. This last week, as I was reading about the importance of sleep, I called my wife and I said, our children are trying to murder us. It's a fact. There was one night this last week where we were up the entire night with various scenarios and various kids and various, gross things that had occurred. I won't get into too much detail, but halfway through the night, Sarah looks at me and she's like, I feel like they're trying to torture us. And it's felt that way for a while. God knows we need rest. And you shouldn't feel ashamed, friends, when you take a break. Do you? I'm looking at some of you and I know, I'm trying not to make eye contact with Deward King. But God knows Elijah is so tired, and sometimes the reality is that what we need is a good old bed and breakfast. But sometimes you actually need a little bit more than that too. Elijah needs more than just a nap and a cake. And so he goes to Mount Horeb. 40 days to the mountain of God. What's the other name for Mount Horeb? Sinai. He's going to the place where God gave the commandments to Moses. He's going to the place where God revealed himself to Moses. Elijah wants to see God. He needs something more than just the nap or the food. He wants to have an encounter with the living God. And when he gets to Mount Horeb, he spends the night in a cave. Probably, if you look at the wording, probably the same cave that Moses received the commandments. And the word of the Lord comes to him. And God asks him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, do you think God is asking this question for God's own sake or for Elijah? It's not like God's like, "Oh, Elijah, what are you doing here? I wasn't expecting you. Wow, this is news to me." No, he's asking the question for Elijah's sake. What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah says, "I've been very zealous for you, and the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away." Remember, Elijah has just defeated the prophets of Baal in dramatic fashion. He's had a huge victory, and yet Jezebel still wants to kill him. And yet Ahab is still the king of Israel. And yet it doesn't seem like much has changed at all. Israel still seems corrupt. In fact, it seems like it's gotten worse for Elijah. And now Elijah is telling God, "I'm the only prophet left, God." Which isn't exactly true, by the way. Elijah might be a little dramatic here. Earlier in the story, Obadiah saved 100 prophets for the Lord, and he hides them in a cave just in a chapter or two before this. And then God even tells Elijah in verse 18, "I have 7,000 people in Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal." In other words, you are not the only one left, Elijah, even though it feels that way right now. You're not as alone as you think you are. How true is that for us, by the way? I don't think we're ever as alone as we think we are. But when you're feeling down, it's easy to tell yourself that, isn't it? I'm so alone, but you're not. God tells Elijah to go outside the cave, stand on the mountain because, Elijah, I am about to pass by. You came here to see me. Well, take a look. So Elijah watches. And there's a great earth-splitting wind, and then an earthquake, and then a fire. But God is not in the wind, the quake, or the fire. And after all these dramatic displays, there is what? The sound of sheer silence. And the implication here is that if God is not in the wind or the quake or the fire, the implication is that God is in the silence. There's a lot of debate about the phrase that's used in our text this morning. Our translation says there was the sound of sheer silence. The old King James Version says a small, still voice. Another way you could read it would be a gentle whisper. But many scholars are convinced that the way to read this phrase is silence. I actually like that translation better. A sheer silence over a still small voice, because personally, I have never heard the audible voice of God. I've never heard the still small voice, but I have a lot of experience with silence. Many people would say that silence is a sign that there is no God, which is why I love this text. Because you have it here, the Bible saying God is actually in the silence. God is saying, don't just look for me in the big dramatic displays of power, but find me, join me in the simple places of solitude and silence. God is in the silence. Now, it might be tempting to see silence as kind of a bad thing, especially in our culture. Maybe not a bad thing, but a thing that we don't really want to make time for. In order to find silence, you have to slow down, don't you? You have to stop being productive. You have to step back. You have to unplug from your screen or your tablet or your iPhone. You got to turn Netflix off to find the silence. And in our rat race of a life, it seems counterintuitive to completely shut everything off and go to the silence. But here you have God saying, I am in the silence. What do you think it does to our character, our soul, our understanding of who we are, of who God is, if we never take the time for the silence? Why do you think Jesus made it such a regular practice in his own life, in his own ministry, to constantly remove himself, go out into the quiet wilderness, and find the silence? When was the last time you went seeking for God in the silence? But some of us might avoid silence and solitude. I understand that for some folks, being silent creates space for the negative voices or the old tapes that start to play in their head. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe it's the voice of a parent that you just keep on hearing it in your head. And when everything is silent, that's the voice that comes up, is you're not enough. You're not good enough. Maybe it's something that happened long ago, that when it's silent and it's still, those bad memories of something bad that happened, that's when those things come up and you start to feel shame or pain. Maybe it's just the having to look at yourself and really see what's going on in your life, and maybe that can be scary. But the kind of silence that we're talking about this morning is a different kind of silence, because the kind of silence where you are seeking God is always a precursor to prayer. And when you start praying in the silence, those bad tapes, those negative voices, they start to lose their power over you as you invite God into the silence. Notice that God asks the same question to Elijah twice. Elijah, what are you doing here? There is silence, and then God asks the question. And when God is asking the question, again, it's not for God's benefit, it's for Elijah's benefit. What's happening? It's an invitation for Elijah to open up, to unburden himself, to tell God what's really going on. I've been so zealous for you, but it's all failed. Nothing's come the way I wanted it to. God asks him again, what are you doing here, Elijah? The silence is a precursor to prayer. And then God tells Elijah, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus and go anoint the next 2 kings and anoint Elisha as the next prophet after you. I want to just take a tangent moment here and realize what God just told Elijah. Okay, I've got another task for you to do. You're going to go anoint these 2 new kings, and then I want you to go and anoint your replacement. And when I read that, it makes me understand that we're all replaceable, right? And that Elijah's time as prophet will come to an end. You only get so much time in your life. And the beautiful thing about silence and solitude is it slows life down and allows you to take a step away from it and remember who God is, who you are, and what God has put you on this earth for. Elijah, your replacement is coming. So what are you going to do with the time that you have left? And now that might make some of you feel like, well, I got to get busier. I got to do more. Time is so scarce that you don't have enough time not to stop and be quiet and silent before the Lord. Elijah came into the wilderness ready to die, right? That's it, God. He's beaten, he's tired, he's depressed. And I want you just to consider, I want you to think about how God responds to Elijah with compassion and care and patience and hospitality. God lets Elijah rest. He feeds him these heavenly cakes. He invites him to express his emotions in prayer. He shows himself. He reveals himself to Elijah. And then he reinstates him. And he sends him back with a new mission. How is God responding? Care, compassion, grace, love. The whole story, if you ask me, is reminiscent of another story that comes from the Gospel of John. And after the Apostle Peter denies Christ 3 times at the moment of Christ's execution, at the moment of Christ's trial and rejection, Peter denies him 3 times. And then Peter runs away. And in John's gospel, he returns to his old profession as a fisherman. And while Peter's out on the water fishing on a boat, the risen Jesus comes to the beach near him. And he cooks breakfast. And Jesus calls out to the disciples on the boat, "Come have breakfast with me." And he feeds them bread and fish. They sit together. And then Jesus, after feeding Peter, after resting with him for a little bit, Jesus reinstates Peter. In this moment, you remember? Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep." God meets Peter in his darkest, most low, shameful moment, and he feeds him. He relaxes with him, and then he reinstates him for his next mission. I love both of these stories of Elijah and Peter, not just because they revolve around food, but because God meets them both in their darkest moments. And he has compassion. Do you know God has compassion for you in your darkest moment? Can you believe that? Do you really believe it? If Christ can have compassion for Peter, he can have compassion for you. Elijah wanted to die. He was afraid and defeated. Peter went back to his old profession. After denying Christ 3 times, he was a failure. But the good news is that God does not disown them. He reinstates them. So the question for you this morning is, where are you at right now in your life journey, in your spiritual journey, in your emotional state? What's going on in your life? Do you have financial problems, family issues, a new or an ongoing health scare? Are you living with a sense of guilt or shame? Are you tired? Are you stressed? Are you afraid? Are you anxious? God meets us in our darkest, lowest moments, and he has compassion. That's not what I would expect. I expect to be rebuked and corrected, but that's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible brings compassion. He nourishes our soul. He invites us to rest, and he asks us, what are you doing here? What's going on? But the question for us is, are we willing to go into the silence and rest with God? And here's the truth, friends. You don't hear the voice of Christ unless you're willing to go into the silence. There's just too many voices going on in our life right now. But when you hear the voice of Christ speaking to you, you know it's the voice of Christ because the words of Christ are always accompanied with the message of the gospel, the good news. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, "My sheep hear my voice and they follow me. My sheep hear my voice and they follow me." And then Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd and I lay down my life for my sheep." The word of God for you, friends, is not condemnation. It's not rejection. It's not shame. It's Jesus saying, hey, I've laid my life down for you, and I've got something for you to do next. Are we willing to listen? Let us pray.